And they were very upset about it. But this is one of the things that became prevalent, was understanding that the king, by grant, never actually gave up title to the land.
The land right here that we're all sitting on?
Yes.
Never gave up title.
I'm sorry, say that again?
Yeah, what do you mean never gave up title? We kicked his butt in the war, did the Declaration, did the Constitution. Doesn't that mean we just kind of take title over, David?
No, that was done by agreement. It was specifically set up in the treaty. See, those men actually ran out of money, and they had to negotiate peace. And the peace had to be negotiated not just with Great Britain. It was negotiated between Great Britain, the King of France, the King of Spain, and the King of the Netherlands and Holland, and different ones. It was more international than people realize. When you read the Treaty of Paris in 1783, which was the document that ended the war, see here again, understanding the construct. The war didn't just end and everyone go home. Mm-hmm. They actually sat down and negotiated a contract, which we call a treaty, and this said, okay, we're agreeing to these terms, and we're all coming together for our mutual benefit and mutual advantage and all those kind of things to happily restore, quote, the good concourse that used to exist. Mm-hmm. And this was when the king agreed to the land grant.
King, which king?
Now sovereign.
Which king?
The king who had given those grants, the King of Great Britain.
Okay, so he agreed to what, sir?
He agreed that they were sovereign and that he would call them sovereign.
And sovereign means there's no one above you?
That they now actually owned the land, that they possessed title to the land, and that they were treated among the family of nations now, as it states in the Law of Nations. Here again, understand, when they put something like the Law of Nations in their documentation, it's because they understand it, and they have read it, and they're going to follow it. Mm-hmm. And they're going to make sure everyone else follows it.
So you said he gave them the land, but they didn't give them title to the land?
Not originally, not with the land grants. If you look at the notes on the state of Virginia by Thomas Jefferson, which were voluminous, you can actually look it up Virginia's library on the line. It's called virginia.edu. And under 13, it talks about the Constitution, which was the Constitution of Virginia. And you will see the land grants in there, how the king held the land in what was called common suckage. Meaning he still had title. He was the grantor. They were the grantee. And under grantor-grantee law, the grantor is still in control. And there were many times when the king would actually take the land grant away from whoever they didn't like and give it to someone else they did like.
Really? So,
yes.
So kind of like what goes on today, where we don't really own property. It's the state or somebody does. Who knows? That's another story. Kind of like that?
It's not just property, it's also your rights. Because in law, constitutional law, and in international law, it says that civil rights are granted. Well, that which is granted can be ungranted. Yeah. And I have 9 cases of case law where they will actually ungrant your civil rights and prosecute you, and actually can charge an innocent person for a crime that never occurred.
Okay,
and
we're going to get into that a little bit down the road, okay? Because the whole idea of civil rights and citizenship is pretty fascinating. But let's stay here a second on this Treaty of Paris, sir, and the Law of Nations, because I think it would be helpful if we understood a little bit about what that was about. The Treaty of Paris, 1783, that you say that's what really kind of ended the war. Who was that between?
Well, the Treaty of Paris, which was called the Definitive Treaty of Peace, was between King George of Great Britain and the United States of America, meaning the 55 men, the 13 states. So actually, to read the treaty, there was only 12 states.
Wow. So there was 55 men with 12 states, and that was called the United States of America, and they did a treaty with King George?
Yes, and you have to understand who King George is, and it explains who King George is in the treaty. It says King George was the King of Great Britain, France, and Ireland. He was the Duke of Luxembourg and Brunswick, and he was the Arch-Treasurer and Prince-Elector of the Holy Roman Empire.
Wow. You're kidding. That guy got around.
No.
That guy got around. Wow.
He had a lot of positions, had a lot of titles. He was the Treasury Department for the Vatican.
So that's how the Vatican is involved in this deal.
Yes.
Wow. And they've been involved since that time. That's pretty interesting.
Don't get me wrong. I didn't want to believe that this stuff was true, but I could not ignore the black ink on white paper from all these documents and treaties.
We, of course, have all heard the connections and the power and the stuff of the Vatican in this country and all of that. And So, and of course we know about King Henry and all that stuff in the Vatican. And so the Treaty of Paris was between the King of England, who was also like the head stopper of pretty much a lot of Europe, and the treasurer of the Vatican?
Yes.
Wow.
I mean, one of the things that puzzled me about the treaty, Patrick, was that how did King George get to be the King of France? I thought King Louis was the King of France.
So did I.
And there's another word that became important in this called suzerain, because there was a hierarchy of kings in Europe, and a suzerain is one king that owes fealty to another king. So the true king of France was King George, and it meant that King Louis was sovereign in his domestic affairs over France, but he was not sovereign in his international affairs.
Meaning, what does that mean? He's not sovereign in international affairs.
That means he couldn't go negotiate treaties and make deals like he made with the United States of America without getting King George's permission, because King George was the true king of France that he owed fealty to.
Oh, I thought we were talking about King George. I'm sorry, I lost you.
No, King Louis was the king of France.
King Louis. Okay. Oh, I missed that. So King Louis couldn't do his thing without King George okaying it.
That's correct.
Okay.
There was a hierarchy of kings, and it comes under what they call the doctrine of suzerainty.
Suzerainty. So the 55 guys who signed the Constitution, they made the deal with George in the Treaty of Paris, which ended the war. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And what does that treaty essentially say?
To boil it down to basics, it gives a land boundary of what their lands are, which were from the St. Lawrence River across all the way down over to the Mississippi, down to the Gulf of Mexico, and over through Florida to, not to the tip, but through the St. Mary's River. And that's the land boundary. So he agreed that they now had the land, and he surrendered title, basically saying, okay, you want me to call you sovereign? I'll treat you as sovereign. However, in Article 4, it states, all bona fide debts heretofore contracted shall meet with no lawful impediment. And since they had not paid King Louis, and since King Louis was subservient to King George was basically saying this: you can have the land, just make sure you pay me the debt.
Because Louis loaned them the money for the Revolutionary War.
That's correct.
And how much was that? Do we know?
It was 18 million livres tourneaux. That was the terminology, but it was literally 18 million gold coins.
A lot of money back then.
A lot of money back then. It would be a lot of money today.
Yeah, would it? Yeah. Oh, yeah, of course. 18 million. You mean 18 million ounces?
Yes.
Wow. That is a lot of money. So he said, you have title to the land, but only if you pay me back?
Yes, that's correct.
Well, we've never really paid them back, have we?
If you read the history, this was what astounded me about the Articles of Confederation, because a lot of people had talked about how the Articles were such a good form of government of the United States of America and so forth.
Right.
And when I started reading, you actually find that the states were, under the Articles of Confederation, they were at war with each other. It says in history that they were having tariff wars. They were not showing up for their Congress meetings. 5 states would show up, 8 would not. So they weren't even honoring their own agreements to actually run a proficient government. And in the course of that, they violated 3 treaties, international treaties, and they also violated the Treaty of Paris, which was where they agreed to pay the king. So they were not paying the king. They violated those treaties. And George Washington wrote a letter to John Jay at that time in 1786, and he said, what are we going to do with these 13 disunited states?
Disunited states?
Yes.
And what does that mean? These guys aren't united. These are fighting among themselves, and they're not paying their bills.
That's correct. That's exactly what he said. They're not paying their requisitions to the king.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, these things cannot go along in this train forever. And the reason they couldn't was because Britain was starting to encroach back on their borders to take everything back.
Because we just weren't paying the freight.